Doesn't it seem obvious that they can't beat Hezbollah? It's impossible. They can't get them out of there.
Well, that's what I couldn't. See, I mean, they had 20 years to do this, right? They were occupied southern Lebanon for 20. Yeah, they only just withdrew a couple of years ago. Finally, well, even there's a little sliver, I think, that's still being held. But for 20 years, and at the end of it, Hezbollah clearly remained intact, and the current offensive, opinion polls are saying 80% of Lebanese support them rather than turning against them.
And even more would support now, because of that overreaction. It's sort of like the military mind has completely overtaken the politics and reality of the bigger situation somehow. It sort of looks.
Yeah, it's not a political solution.
No,
the negotiations have stopped. The military solution creates new martyrs and new dissidents and fuels the future rebellion and opposition. So there's got to be a change of tack. Israel is pursuing a short-term policy that is simply stop the rockets, and that involves stopping Hezbollah, disarming Hezbollah, or at least pushing Hezbollah back beyond the rocket range. It's a temporary solution.
Yeah.
And I think you're quite right. Israel's not going to occupy the southern Lebanon for a long period of time. When they withdraw, as they did 6 years ago, then Hezbollah will reform. They'll go back to the same defensive positions. They will rearm. They will stockpile, and then they will attack at a time of their choosing, or a time of Iran's choosing, or whoever is calling the shots. And the same scenario will repeat itself. So it's very depressing. The Israeli point of view is that, okay, we've talked to the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat and everyone else for decades, and we've got nowhere, so we're just going to build a wall. I'm going to build a defensive perimeter. We're going to withdraw from untenable positions like the West, like Gaza, and even there, a lot of Israelis are saying that was a mistake. It just brings the front line closer to us. And we're going to go on about our business unless the rest of the Middle East do whatever it wants. And as long as we can protect ourselves, that's our objective.
Even the question, I mean, does Israel have a right to exist? You see, I mean, it gets posed in this way all the time. And to me, the argument is does an apartheid state, because Israel has been occupying the West Bank and Gaza, and effectively it still controls. They control the entry and output out, from Gaza, and they got the settlements. And even after the peace agreement was signed, 93 was it? After the peace agreement was signed, the number of settlers had doubled in the next 5 years. So on the West Bank and Gaza. So the settlements include 500,000 people in these settlements in the West Bank. You've got don't have them in Gaza, but you've got 500,000 people in these settlements in the West Bank. They control the water. They don't want to go anywhere. So what's left of the Palestinian state, it will never be accepted that there be a Palestinian state in all of the 67 territories with Jerusalem as its capital, and the people have the right of return. That the Israelis will never accept, because it brings into question their right to exist, I think.
So this week and for the preceding 2 weeks, there's been a lot of bombing, rockets, shelling, and a large number of deaths. At least 700 deaths have occurred in the Lebanon-Israeli border. There are multiple reports. We know how many buildings have been destroyed. There's a general acceptance that Israel has overreacted. We know that a couple of Israeli soldiers were captured, and this apparently sparked off the whole incident. However, in the absence of some historical context, the whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And even Israelis themselves, the ones I heard anyway on radio, said, well, we don't agree with the number of deaths going on. We have great sympathy for the Lebanese civilians, and the whole thing is not really. We don't understand why we're both dying. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that it's about time that it did make some sense. So in that context, this week I'm talking to Mike Treen from the Unite Union, with a long history in the socialist or left movement, and Steve Hoadley from Auckland University, Senior Lecturer in Political Studies at Auckland University, who Steve openly admits would come from a more sympathetic position and from the Israeli point of view. Also, I'd like to show parts of an interview with Ali Kazak, a representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization, who explains things, how the history of Israel and its development looks over the border in what's left of Palestine. So between these three, I hope that we can get some sort of better understanding and some sense into the crazy situation that's going on in the Middle East today.
The Palestine question started in 1896 when a man, Austrian Jewish man in the name of Herzl, came with the idea of establishing a Jewish colony. And as you would know, it was during that period the peak of colonialism. And his idea was that why not us Jews also have slice from the cake of colonialism. So he wrote a book called The Jewish State in 1896. And 1 year later, in 1897, he called for a conference in Basel in Switzerland. That conference was attended by about 275 Jewish representatives, most of them from Russia. And he proposed the idea to them, the conference, and that was the first Zionist conference. And political Zionism started then.
Yeah, Mike, that was a very interesting clip, but from a Jewish perspective, and by the way, I'm not Jewish or a Zionist, but I have studied the situation for many years. The first thing he said was that the Zionists wanted to establish a colony. In their view, they were simply resuming their residency in the Jewish homeland. That is, the first and second temple remains were there. There were Jewish communities in the Palestinian area that had been there since the Roman times. And the European Jews had also been subject to pogroms, very severe racial discrimination, including violence and death, immortalized, of course, in Fiddler in the Roof, in Russia and in Poland. And they were desperate to find a place where they could protect themselves. It is true that the Jews did assist, the wealthy Jews of Britain did assist the war effort in World War I. The British government was very grateful. Lord Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration in which he put his pledge that the Jews should find a homeland. The British were lenient in allowing Jews to migrate, to purchase land, and to take up settlement. Ali Kazak quite correctly says there were uprisings. The Jews would call them pogroms, racial attacks on Jewish communities, and they then organized to defend themselves. The three groups, the Irgun, Stern Gang, and Haganah, were initially self-protection groups. Later on were converted into nationalist groups to contest British rule because the Jewish agency thought the British were not protecting Jewish interests, that is, they were not keeping law and order, and the Jews felt that they had to, first of all, take matters in their own hands with their self-protection groups, their militia, if you wish, to use a modern term, but then eventually to establish their own state where they could protect themselves from what they regarded was threats from the Palestinian and Arab communities.
I think what was important was that there was a Jewish community in the area we know as Palestine, but the vast majority of Jews, probably 90+% in the world, lived elsewhere. And the idea of going to Palestine and establishing a Jewish state was a new idea in response in part to the continued pogroms and discrimination they faced in Europe principally. But it remained very much a minority opinion within the Jewish community in Europe right through to the Holocaust, essentially, I think. So that the Zionist movement, which saw this as the only solution to anti-Semitism and discrimination, was a small minority movement within the Jewish community. Overwhelmingly, in fact, the Jewish community of Europe was left-wing and socialist in its inclinations, tended to support the social democratic parties of Germany, the Russian social democratic parties, often played quite leadership roles in those parties, and they saw the solution to the Jewish question, to the history of racism and pogroms and so on. They saw the solution as creating a just societies in their own community. It was only with the Holocaust that was finally shattered for the majority of Jews, that any solution other than creating a state of their own was a legitimate thing. That's why I think the Zionist movement sought the sponsorship of the imperial powers, or to assist them in this project. They weren't going to be able to do it on their own, and they traded their support for sponsorship in some way. That if you help us get there, if you facilitate the movement, we will assist your domination of the region. But by sponsoring themselves in that way, they put themselves, and the settlements, they ended up in opposition to the desire of the Palestinian people, who had lived there for several thousand years, in the vast majority, to the Palestinian peoples, to their desire for independence, so that the Jewish settlers, rather than uniting with the Palestinians for an independent unitary state, or a state of independence where they could live together, they ended up opposing these moves towards independence. And they also opposed any attempts at genuine, because the Palestinian people were often fighting, in that period, were often fighting for reforms within their own society. They had landlords, they had the sheiks and whatnot running the show, who were doing the deals with the British. But again, instead of supporting any progressive land reform that would give land to the peasants, they would oppose that, because that created new barriers to their acquiring land in Palestine. So I think you have a fundamental problem, and the root of the problem in the Middle East, the root of the problem in Palestine, of trying to establish a society that excludes and is opposed to those who already live there. Whatever the motivations, and the history of pogroms and the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, the history of the motivation to escape that, but but the solution wasn't a progressive solution that would allow people to live together. It was a solution tied to imperial powers that was going to establish a proxy, a settler state that would do the bidding of the imperial powers. And I think it's true, they simply traded one for the other. When they wanted they wanted to establish their state, the Holocaust gave the final sort of impetus for a large Jewish immigration, and a conviction for many Jews that no solution is possible without that. But the solution put them at odds with the existing population and the region, and the solution in fact becomes a ghetto, and a ghetto in permanent war with its neighbours. And I don't think it's viable. That type of society, that type of exclusivity is just, or can bring justice for the Jews or the Arabs of the Middle East.
They sent the delegation to the Sultan of Turkey offering him help, financial help and assistance in return for giving them Palestine. The Sultan refused and sent him away, and he said his famous saying that I don't own Palestine and I cannot give you something I don't own. They sent delegations to the Pope of Rome, to the Tsar of Russia, to France and so on. All sent them away, and they refused to help until they found in Britain was convinced, and they found that in the scheme they are being proposed as a good scheme, and that there is common interest in that scheme. Because the Zionists said to Britain, you help us take over Palestine, in return we will help to serve your interest in the Middle East. And Britain knew that it was the era of liberation, and that they could not maintain, the colonialist rule and occupation in the Middle East. So they found in Zionism as a good way to safeguard their interest in the Middle East, and we all know how much interest there is in the Middle East for superpowers and colonialist states. Now, it is extremely important to know that in 1917, when Britain promised the Zionists to give them Palestine, the Jewish population in Palestine were merely 6.8%. And they did not own more than 2.4% of the land. And as soon as the Ottomans were defeated, and they were defeated mainly because of the help of the Arab revolution and the revolt against the Ottomans. So the Arabs also started revolting against either the French or the British, whoever was occupying them at the time, and they gained their independence one after the other. But for us in Palestine, it was double difficult because we were not only facing the British colonialists, but also settlers who were coming and being organized underground and trained militarily. The Zionists established 3 underground Jewish terrorist groups, one called the Haganah, one called the Sting Gang, and one called the Urgun. And so the Palestinians started revolting against, the British colonialists. They revolted in 1919, 1921, 1923, 1925, 27, 29, 31, 33. And that, and every time they revolt, the British would send more troops. They will arrest the leaders, put them in jail, disarm the people, and so on. And another year or two, another revolt, And as you can see it, until now, this revolt's continuing until today. So Britain, in 1947, threw the whole issue to the United Nations, knowing that the Zionists were ready to take it over, saying that we can't handle the situation any longer in Palestine. There are two trouble there, so they asked the United Nations to find a solution. United Nations sent delegation to investigate, and that delegation came out back with recommendation to partition Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and Palestinian state. So what the United Nations did is that they gave the new European Jewish settlers 56% of Palestine to establish a Jewish state, and they gave us, the 2/3 indigenous Palestinians, less than half of our country. But not only that, they gave them our best cities and cultivated land, our best land. And they gave us the desert and the mountains and the uncultivated. We rejected the United Nations partition plan, saying that the United Nations have no power to partition any country against the wishes of the majority of its people, which is still true today. And we were calling for the British to get out, for Palestine to be independent, and for people to live together regardless of their religious background, on an equal system. The Zionists accepted the partition because the United Nations gave them the legitimacy they were looking for the first time, but with the intention not to implement the partition plan. And they started their war against us in order to turn the non-Jewish majority into minority and the Jewish minority into majority. They committed 36 massacres. One of the most famous massacres, called the Deir Yassin massacre, and we have here a Palestinian brother who was witness to the Deir Yassin massacre, who was in Palestine, in Jerusalem at the time. Deir Yassin is a small village in the outskirts of Jerusalem. They attacked that village and they killed in cold blood every man, woman, and child. And they left a few eyewitnesses who, they took them to witness the whole massacre in front of their eyes. And then they told them to go to the nearby villages and towns and tell them that the Jews are coming to do with them what we have done now in Deir Yassin. And you can imagine someone seeing their relatives, their cousins, their neighbors, their loved ones slaughtered in front of their eyes. Those few poor eyewitnesses, they went out of their brains and they started running from one village to the other, calling on the people to flee with their children because the Jews are coming to do with you what they have done in Deir Yassin, and they used to describe the horror they've just witnessed. So people without anyone to protect them, and the British were not there to protect us, they were oppressing us, and no army and no police force, no arms. First thing they will do, they will take their children and run to a safe place until it is safe to return. And that was the last time those people saw their houses again.
Ali Kazak's version of history touches on some important points on which the Israeli or Jewish version would differ. The first is that the Jews regarded their movement into the Palestine area as legitimate in the sense that they purchased land from the landowners. Admittedly, the landowners were oppressing the ordinary fedayeen, a point that you make quite clearly and correctly. And so this could be regarded as illegitimate, but the Jews do feel that they purchased land in good faith. They had title to the land. They were not, in fact, displacing by force individuals. Second point to make is that, yes, the Jews organized themselves, and their displacement living apart from the Palestinian community was not deliberate on their part. The Jewish history has it that attempts were made to cross bridges, to join hands, to work together. The Palestinians did not participate in the independence struggle. They did not have a political organization. They didn't really organize themselves in the way that the Jews did. So when it came time to oppose the British, then the Jews did it themselves. The Palestinians were not participants in that. With regard to the partition, what Ali Kazak didn't say was that, of course, the Palestine Mandate included Transjordan, and that what is now what we call Israel and the West Bank is a tiny sliver, less than a quarter of Transjordan. And many people regard Jordan as the true Palestinian area. That is the statement that the Palestinians got only 43% of what is now the small area of Israel plus Gaza plus West Bank. In fact, if you include all of Transjordan, then the Jews got less than a quarter or a fifth of it, and the Palestinians were regarded as the rightful heirs to the rest of Israel plus Transjordan, which we now know as Jordan. With regard to the massacres, yes, the facts are there. The Israeli version, of course, is that there were gunmen and that these people were killed in the heat of combat. Israeli soldiers were prosecuted eventually for exceeding their orders, and the official position is there was no urging of Palestinians to leave the territories, that they were urged by the Arab governments around them, and not by the Israeli authorities themselves. In fact, they urged them to stay because they wanted them to coexist. They wanted them as neighbors, as workers in the new state, because there was quite a lot to be done. A final point that I might make is that none of the Arab governments recognized the Palestinians as a separate political entity. That is, Syria did and still does regard the Palestine area as part of Greater Syria. And one of Syria's implicit goals is not to support a strong Palestinian movement, but rather, if they could get all their Christmases at once, in fact, Palestine and Israel would be Greater Syria, along with Lebanon and parts of the historical wilaya of Syria. And no other government at that period of time acknowledged the Palestinians as having a political presence, a political mandate, but rather they were subordinate to the established governments of the day. It was only later that the Palestinians were able to form themselves, which we'll come to soon, and to attract the support of Arab governments who then regarded them as part of the anti-Zionist, anti-American movement of pan-Arabism. Final point is that certainly the Jews attempted to work with the powers of the day for their common interests, but of course when their interests diverged, the Jews could very easily make war on the British, and in fact did so successfully that the British voluntarily left because they were finding it too expensive and too injurious politically and materially to remain. Likewise, the state of Israel has on many occasions disagreed sharply with the United States. So it is, I think, drawing a long bow to characterize the Israelis as tools of the imperialists doing their bidding, because they're quite capable of being very, very difficult partners when it's in their self-perceived interests.
The Palestinian peoples have been victims over this last few centuries of some of their own rulers, some of the Arab states, and the establishment of the Jewish state. The fundamental injustice, however, I think, which the Palestinian refer to as the catastrophe, the fundamental injustice was, I think, the creation of this state and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. This was deliberate. This was conscious. This was deliberate. Even with the partition, the Israeli, the Zionist movement wasn't satisfied with the 56%. And there was, before the war, the official war started in 1948, before the official war started over the Declaration of Independence and the war with some of the neighbouring Arab armies, there had been 6 months of fighting in which massacres like Deir Yassin occurred, in which one of the other most important, the expulsion from Ramal and Lida of the Palestinian population. The Zionist forces seized those towns, and when Ben-Gurion was asked what was going to happen to the population, waved his hand and said, throw them all out, throw them out. And 100,000 people ended up in Ramallah and never came back, and were part of the 400,000 that, as a consequence of Deir Yassin, as a consequence of that, that ended up fleeing their properties for fear of their lives, and once the Israeli state was established and secure, were never allowed to return. Now, whatever, if you believed that they had democratic credentials in their goals and their aims, if you believed they wanted to live with their Arab neighbours, these 400,000 people who had fled were victims of, if it was because they were encouraged to flee by the Arab rulers, they were still victims. If it was because it was rogue elements in the Israeli armed forces that did all the massacres that caused them to flee, and it wasn't a deliberate act, then the first thing you do, and Geneva Convention should demand, is you allow them to return. They did not want them to return because they did not want them part of the state. This was established as a racial state. This was a Jewish state. The rights belonged to the Jewish people. They never wanted a significant Arab minority within that state that they would have to deal with. That you couldn't even join the Israeli trade union until 1956 if you were an Arab. It was a Jewish trade union. When they bought the land, they had an agency for buying land, and the Jewish National Fund, and part of it was never to be sold to a non-Jew. Once they secured whatever land they had, it was never to be sold to a non-Jew. And the economic organisations they established, Ben-Gurion, others, they all argued strongly that we want only Jews to be employed. We want only Jews to be employed by our business. We want only Jews to be employed on our farms. And insofar as we have to employ non-Jews for a period, we want to make that period as short as possible. This was designed as a conquest and an exclusive project for Jews only, and that's the fundamental problem, because once you embark on a project like that, you can be nothing but racist, you can be nothing but discriminatory to your neighbour or to the potential citizen. Fundamental problem with the 400, if they wanted to live in peace, to share this territory, the refugees would have gone home. Why this question is still being debated, the right of return as they call it, the right of return still remains a fundamental problem on any peace settlement between the Palestinian people and the Israeli state. This question of the right of return still remains a fundamental problem, because the expulsion, and I believe it was an expulsion, the expulsion of those hundreds of thousands of people remains an injustice that's unresolved. And it ends up, but what happens when you have an unresolved injustice, I think, is you have to keep repeating it. You have to keep repeating it. And that's where the conflicts in '67, the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the war that's going on today, the invasion of Lebanon, it's repeating the fundamental mistake.
Just to put on the record that there are 1 million Arabs, non-Jews, living in the state of Israel who have full voting rights, and those that did not flee, of course, have full property rights and are treated as equal citizens, with a few exceptions, armed forces, intelligence services, and certain other security services, as I understand it. But of course, there are Arab political parties in the Knesset who are participating in a racially or religiously fairly equal sense. And these people are not under threat, as I understand it, and are fully fledged, with a few exceptions, citizens of the State of Israel. So whether it's racist or also the Jews from Europe and from Africa and the Middle East come from so many different races. I think we really have to talk about religious differences. It is a religious state, but racism is a colonial and imperial term imposed by the colonial powers, and I think we're leaving that term behind in discourse pretty rapidly.
Through these acts of terror, Israel, or the Jewish terrorist groups, they were able to dispossess 70% of the Palestinian nation, and they occupied 78% of Palestine, and they declared in May 1948 the establishment of the State of Israel. The United Nations passed resolution number 194 calling on Israel to let the Palestinian refugees return and to pay them compensation. Israel refused to do so.
So far we've talked about the context, the historical context from which Israel was carved out of an area that is now known as Palestine, but obviously at that time a lot of the states that we now deal with didn't even exist. Certainly the power politics didn't exist. But one thing that did exist after 1917, after the First World War, which was a very early period of formation of Israel, and with which Israel and the rest of the world has virtually lived with ever since, is the division of the world into a loosely socialist and capitalist sides. And I think it would be misleading and confusing not to deal with the real politic of the global scene within which Israel and the whole Middle East is operating. The Middle East to me is a flashpoint where the global forces meet, simply because, well, for a start, there's a lot of oil there, and therefore all global, all national economies are very interested in supplies of oil and have been for a long, long time. Plus, they are generally aligned either with the socialist or the capitalist way, now called the global economy. I think it would be quite important for both of you to comment as to where Israel has historically and to this day stands within that ongoing struggle within the Middle East. Naturally, I'm biased. I believe that, I'll just state it straight out, that Israel has defended the interests of the capitalist side from the beginning and continues to do so, and that it might be a difficult partner. Nevertheless, it is somewhat of an enforcer for first the British and now the United States within this very important, though small, part of the world.
Mike, I think Alan has a very good point. I wouldn't use the term capitalism and socialism, but certainly if you're talking about free markets, investment, multinationals, technology, Israel does represent that stream of thinking and that way of conducting international economics for sure. Whether it's an enforcer, I think I have a little problem with that in the sense that Israel's policies have been directed mainly to situations within its own borders, that is defensive, reactive policies rather than expensive policies. Now, the big exception was the 1967 war when the Arab countries amassed at the borders of Israel. Israel then counterattacked, and the Sinai and the West Bank and the Golan Heights passed, and parts of Lebanon came under the authority, under the physical control of Israel. Some of these were returned. The Sinai was negotiated away. And of course, the peace was made with Jordan in due course. The West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights remain. a problem. And of course, Israel is now in the process of reoccupying portions of the Lebanon. But this, I think, falls short of enforcing any kind of geopolitical or geoeconomic ideology on the rest of the region. What Israel does do in a very quiet way is trades prolifically with other Arab countries. And there are a great many Arab countries, particularly the Gulf states, the moderate states, that welcome bilateral trade and other exchanges with Israel. They're very reluctant to publicize these because they are officially opposed to the Jewish state, but they find it mutually profitable to do technology exchanges, capital investment, bilateral trade, and other arrangements. So there is a growing free marketism in the Middle East, and Israel is very much part of that, even though it's not acknowledged openly because politically it's a sensitive question.
I think it's a little more than that. Because of the way the state was established, I think it required sponsorship from 1917 onwards, even although it ran into conflict with the British towards the latter part of it, and just prior to the independence and establishment of the Israeli state. It required the facilitation of the British. It maintained close relationships with Britain and France, and in 1956, with the nationalisation of the Suez Canal, joined Britain and France in an invasion of Egypt. Its continued existence and prosperity is very dependent on the United States. I mean, there's no country in the world gets more per capita aid. Military aid is in the billions of dollars a year. Total aid, probably $3 to $5 billion a year, is an extraordinary sum of money from the US state, let alone the supporters, sympathizers and supporters as well around the world. So this state, this military power, this political power, economic power in the region is very dependent on its relations with the United States, and keeping those close. There will be friction. We're not even sure, of course, sometimes whether the friction is real or it's for diplomatic purposes. Like at the moment, there appears to be a little bit of friction over whether there's going to be a ceasefire, for how long, and who's going to start it. And not sure whether that's for domestic consumption or is actually a real difference. I thought it was actually quite extraordinary that the latest invasion was so strongly supported by the United States that there was not even the tut-tut type telling off that you occasionally got even from Reagan or Bush, the first Bush or Clinton. This was the solidarity towards Israel in this conflict, I think, in Lebanon and in Gaza, has been very, very close. So, do they want to? Do these movements in this area challenge the interests of the empire? I think that of the U.S. empire. Do they have a reason for supporting and giving Israel billions of dollars? Yeah, I think they do. I think it's oil. I think it's the fact that those states are actually relatively weak and can't control their own populations. So they keep having periodic rebellions and are destabilized. That the stability that in that region of tremendous instability and unfriendly governments, you have this one which is nuclear armed and is able, as a last resort, to militarily defeat its neighbours, and it remains superior in that regard. It can, in a formal war, defeat any of them, I suspect.
1956, Israel, along with France and Britain, attacked Egypt in what is now known as the Suez Canal War, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. In 1967, Israel attacked again, and this time they occupied what remained of Palestine, bringing all of historic Palestine under their occupation, mainly the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as parts of other Arab countries. In 1973, the United Nations passed resolution number 242, calling on Israel to get out of the territories it occupied as a result of 1967 war. Israel refused. So when the Arabs, the Arabs waited until 1973, and when they realized that the international community is powerless to force Israel to get out of their occupied territories, Syria and Egypt launched the war against Israel to liberate their territories, which was known as the October War. Then superpowers intervened, they had ceasefire, and the United Nations passed another resolution called 338, in which it reaffirmed its position on United Nations Resolution 242 and called again on Israel to get out of the occupied territories and solve the Palestine, the refugee question. 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon with the aim to destroy the PLO for what the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, represent. And that is the national rights of the Palestinian people.
Now, the United States does not control Israel. What could happen is that U.S. aid, which is about $3 billion a year, could be scaled back if the U.S. runs into financial difficulties, which I'm sure that it will be. Israel would have to tighten its belt. It would have fewer resources, less able to project power. It would still defend itself to the death, the Masada complex, using nuclear weapons as the final defense if necessary. But I don't think it'll come to that. The Israelis you talk to say, look, U.S. aid constitutes 1 or 2% of the budget. We can live without it if we have to. It's very nice to have it, and the political support. But we've been isolated in the UN since the beginning. We don't need the US. We fought our own battles. We're used to being without friends. We'll deal with people quietly, like economic interchange with Arab countries, quietly, which is beneficial to both sides. But it's not going to win us votes in the UN, and we're used to that. So, what's new? We're willing to go ahead on that basis. So I don't think the U.S. support is essential to Israel's survival.
Whether it can defeat insurgency, like the Hezbollah on an ongoing basis, is a different question. But on standing army versus standing army, they can knock over probably anyone in that region. Going as far as Tehran might be a problem, but pretty much anybody else. Lebanon, they could destroy the Lebanese army, they could destroy the Syrians, the Jordanians, probably knock over the Egyptians even, if it came to that. So, and all of those states know it, and they all live with that reality, and I think that's part of what keeps them in line. It's part of what keeps them not straying too far from the interests of the US, and it doesn't necessarily have to be exercised all the time. It exists, it's there, it's the ultimate power, and the unity of interests I think they have are quite. Whether it's the role of a stooge, if you like, I don't think that's true. This is an independent state with its own interests, but that their interests coincide with those of the US, that when things get out of control, when actually governments get more democratic or more popular or more, when the people start getting involved in politics in the sort of in that Gulf region, it tends to produce governments that the US don't like. So they have no interest, I don't believe, in this promoting sort of democracy, transformation, all the rest of it in the Arab world. They prefer keeping those states weak and controlled, and when they step out of line, to be able to act to destroy them. And if they can't do it themselves, they've got the Israelis to help them. Lebanon has been, in a sense, a Syrian dominated state since they were brought since they entered Lebanon in the early 80s, after the Israeli invasion, stabilised, I think, bringing an end to the civil war. But they have a significant influence in Lebanon, and the United States was able recently to actually push back that influence in Lebanon, or supported the pushing back of that influence in Lebanon. And many Lebanese were in favour of pushing back that influence too, no question about that. But they do have a relationship with Hezbollah. They do have a relationship with the Iranians. They now have a mutual defence pact between Syria and Iran, and Americans are concerned about Syria's not doing enough to stop guns and people and whatever going across the border into Iraq. That the quagmire they are reaching in Iraq, it's a bit like, and I think America is facing the same situation, but it's a problem. It's the same situation with Israel. You have it's the gamblers. I don't know what you call it. It's a double or nothing approach. I think that both the Americans and the Israelis at the moment have a bit of a double or nothing approach to fixing the problem. We can't fix it in Iraq. Double or nothing. Extend the war to Iran or Syria or Lebanon or whatever. And for the Israelis, the ultimate security for them is actually, I think, also to destroy any potential threat to them in regimes that are hostile to Israel, Syria, Iran, the force in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, not necessarily the Lebanese government.
Mike, I agree with your analysis. Countries do try to protect themselves from threat, and they ally with other countries, and they occasionally interfere with other countries' governments and policies in order to protect themselves. So your diagnosis, I agree with. Your prediction, I hope you're wrong. That is, double or nothing sounds like extended war without end in the Middle East, and we hope that sensible leaders will draw back from that abyss, because ultimately it is the people that suffer. The innocent victims we've seen on the TV in the last few weeks and right throughout human history are testament to the fact that governments fight wars, but the people in fact bleed, and their homes are destroyed, whereas the leaders often suffer no injury or damage. It's an unfair world in that respect. But yeah, I would agree that there is a proxy war going on, in the sense that the United States sees the real threat from Iran, from the nuclear weapons development program, from radical Islam, from Shiite Islam. They see Hezbollah then as an extension of Shiite radicalism, jihadism, possibly terrorism. And they see the Hamas in a similar light, and Syria as an accomplice in this axis, as it were. And that's why the United States has been muted in its criticisms of Israel. And perhaps secretly pleased that Israel is going to try to curb the Hamas rockets and demilitarize the southern Lebanon. And this would be in U.S. interest. You're quite absolutely right. Whether it's a larger conspiracy, I have my doubts, in the sense that countries find it very difficult to agree in longer term projects. They make tactical alliances. At least my reading of an analysis of politics is that tactical alliances fall apart, allies become enemies, and vice versa. Opportunism rules rather than long-term benignity or strategic thinking. So whether this particular axis will last between the Iranians, the Sunnis in Iraq, the Syrians who are Alawite, and the Hezbollah, who have their own interests in Lebanon because they're based there partly as a political party, not only as a jihadist or a liberationist movement, and Hamas, of course, and other groups in the West Bank. Whether this lasts, I think, is in question. And likewise, will the United States stay the course, or will it eventually leave Iraq, draw back, consolidate its position, and declare victory while in fact retreating, as it did in Vietnam? I'm pessimistic that the United States can stamp its approval and its authority on the Middle East. I think all the things you've said and some of the things I've said indicate it's a much bigger problem than one country, even a superpower, can manage. And that I think in the coming year we're going to see some accommodation, some climbing down, and some compromises that will give a little more room for maneuver to local Middle Eastern governments and even movements such as Hamas.
They feared, or they actually argued this quite openly, that this permanent occupation can't continue because the Palestinians might change tack and demand democratic rights within Palestine. No longer seek a mini-state, no longer seek but simply change their struggle from a two-state to a one-state. We are all here. We're controlled by the Israelis. We will stop doing the terrorism in a sense, or stop trying to control our own little territory, and we'll start a civil rights movement for equal rights and citizenship and the right to vote. We don't want that, they said, because that makes us look bad. We don't want that, but I personally think that ultimately that is the only solution. I think it's a dead end. I think the
two-state solution is a dead end?
Yeah, I think it's over. I think it had a possibility if Israel had been willing to completely withdraw from the occupied from the West Bank and the Gaza, completely withdraw from the occupied territories, allow the Jerusalem, or half of it, half of it to be the capital of a united Palestinian state. But since the and might have even been theoretically possible in the early 90s when there were only 150,000 settlers there, but there's now half a million or something. 400, is it? Quarter of a million. Yeah. Well, there's a question of counting is partly the Jerusalem.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
the Jerusalem settlements as well. So probably they could have compromised on the Jerusalem, a bit here, bit there, but it just seems impossible now, and so. So the choice for the Palestinians is, I don't think they will ever accept the little bits that they've got left over as being a viable solution to their problem. So is it actually a more realistic thing to toss aside the two-state solution and then go for equal citizenship rights, which is then a dilemma. You've got 5 million Jewish people and 5 million
outvoted. Yes,
well,
the arithmetic would not be pleasant to the Israeli government.
No,
it would create whole new dilemmas.
No.
Yeah, you're pessimistic because I don't think either. If the two-state solution isn't going ahead, I don't think the Israelis will accept the one-state solution.
No, I know they won't.
And they won't accept attacks across their border either, and they'll retaliate. You seem to be portraying an unending cycle of conflict, action and reaction, without any discernible end.